Be studying Matthew 24, and if time permits, we're going to get into chapter 25 also, because this sermon of Christ that he teaches his disciples here on the Mount of Olives after he leaves the temple, it actually runs from Matthew 24:4 all the way to the end of chapter 25 and verse 46. And so Matthew 24 and 25 go together. Um, Matthew 25 begins, then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins. And so a study of these chapters will show that Christ covers a time period involving the final week determined upon Israel, what we call the 70th week of Daniel. It goes through his second coming and the end of this present evil world, all the way up to the establishment of the world to come. And what Christ is doing here in Matthew 24 and 25 is he's establishing chronology and the order of events. Brother Bobby always talks about the importance of studying the Bible with reference to time. Real quick, if you got your Bibles, start here in Matthew 24. I want to show you how much of these chapters are about time. And the reason this is important is because they ask him in verse 3 of Matthew 24, tell us when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And so they ask Christ a question here, and he spends this whole sermon expounding these things to them. And what he's doing is establishing chronology, the order of events. If you look down at verse number 6, he says, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Verse number 8, he says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. Verse 9 begins with the word then. Verse 10, and then. Then he comes down in verse 13, he that shall endure unto the end. Verse 14, and then shall the end come. Verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. Verse 16, then let them which be in Judea. Verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation. And except, verse 22, and except those days shall be shortened. Verse 23, then. And he just keeps going on, guys. And what Christ is doing here, he's answering the question of his disciples, and he's establishing chronology in order to keep them from being deceived. And what he's doing is he's showing them the order of events so that they will know what must come to pass before he comes. And then he goes down there and talks about verse 29, after the tribulation of those days that he's just defined. He says, then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. And so he's establishing chronology here, or the order of events, so that we can understand time. But the sad reality is that many people misuse Matthew 24, and that's why we are going to do these lessons. Couple of things to point out what people do. Number one is they use Matthew chapter 24 to try to show that every time there's an earthquake, every time there's a war, every time they try to use this chapter as to point to the world around them and say, this is this sign and this is that sign, trying to convince people that these things are at hand. And they do this because they're ignorant of Paul's mystery. The Apostle Paul told us in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse number 1, now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto him, that ye be not soon shaken in mind or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. And so every person today who uses Matthew chapter 24 to try to convince you that the end is at hand and that we are living in a time when these things are being fulfilled is completely ignorant of the Pauline revelation. The things in Matthew 24 cannot come to pass until the mystery revealed to Paul is fulfilled. And Paul pleads with you by the rapture, by the coming of our Lord and our gathering together unto him, not to be soon shaken in mind or be troubled, as that the day of Christ is at hand. And so people that use this chapter that way completely ignore the fact that all of Matthew 24 revolves around the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. There hasn't been a temple standing in Jerusalem since 70 AD. And therefore, the things of Matthew 24 cannot come to pass until there's a temple in Jerusalem. And so everybody trying to convince people that every time there's an earthquake or every time there's a war, that Matthew 24, that we're living at a time we're not living at, is ignorant of some things. Second, you've got what we call preterists. The preterists use Matthew 24. They'll use verse. They'll go over to verse 34. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. And they'll try to convince you that because Christ said that, then that means all things were fulfilled already, and that the destruction of Jerusalem that Christ is telling about Matthew 24 happened in 70 AD. And that's what the preterist teaches, that it's already been fulfilled. And yet, if you continue reading into Matthew 25, when did Christ show up, sit on the throne of his glory, and judge all nations, and cast the goat nations into everlasting fire? And when did the sheep nations ever inherit the kingdom prepared from the foundation of the world? You see, the meek have yet to inherit the earth, as the Bible prophesied. This world is still being ran by the wicked. This world is still under the course of this world is still according to the prince of the power of the air. And so these things could not have been fulfilled yet. The preterist has the same problem that the other people have. They're ignorant of Paul's mystery. They're ignorant of what happened after Christ went back to heaven. And then you have people who use Matthew 24, guys like Stephen Anderson. They go to Matthew 24:29, and where it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven. And then in verse 31, he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, and from one end of heaven to the other. And they use Matthew 24 to mistime the rapture. And so you see there, the rapture happens at the end of or after the tribulation. Once again, same problem that they all have. Ignorance of Paul's mystery. Christ is not talking about the rapture anywhere in Matthew 24. The rapture is a mystery revealed through the Pauline revelation. This church of this dispensation, this gathering that God is gathering at this present time out of Israel and out of the nations to create a new man in heaven, of which Christ is the head. The gathering of that church at the rapture is something that's not yet been revealed in Genesis through the entire Old Testament. And people trying to date the rapture or prove the rapture or teach the rapture prior to the Pauline revelation is ignorant of the mystery. And so right off the bat, we see that all those who misuse the book, the chapter we're dealing with, Matthew 24, everybody who misuses this chapter has one thing in common. They all have one thing in common, and that's ignorance of the mystery revealed to the Apostle Paul. As Paul said in Romans 11:25, he says, "For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye be wise in your own conceits." And so people who are misusing this chapter is because they're wise in their own conceits. And the reason they're wise in their own conceits is because they're ignorant of mystery. When Christ speaks, Matthew 24, the mystery has not yet been revealed, and he is dealing here with the things prophesied concerning Jerusalem and the Jewish people and the nation of Israel prior to his return to the earth. They know nothing of the mystery. Christ has not taught them the mystery yet, and these things are going to be revealed after he dies, resurrects, and goes back to heaven. And so here in Matthew 24, 1 through 2, we're going to see, number one, the first problem men make with Matthew 24 is they ignore the immediate context of Matthew 24. They take the whole chapter, ignore the context, and then use it for their own agenda. All right, let's look at it here. Matthew 24, 1 through 2. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And his disciples came to him for to shew him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And so the context of Matthew 24 is the utter destruction and desolation of the temple and Jerusalem. In Luke 21:20, Christ told them, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, know that the desolation thereof is nigh at hand. And so the context of Matthew 24 we see here is Christ telling his disciples about all those buildings there. They're sitting on the Mount of Olives. They're looking at Jerusalem. They're looking at the buildings of the temple. And Christ tells them, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And so that's the context of Matthew 24. It concerns the destruction of Jerusalem and the desolation of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. In verse 3, they come to him. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately. Now in Mark 13, it tells you that it was John, James, Peter, and Andrew. They come to him, and now notice this. They ask him two questions. Tell us, when shall these things be? What things? The destruction of the temple and the desolation of Jerusalem. Christ just told them what's going to happen, and they ask him, tell us, when shall these things be? Then the second question is, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Now that's the context. The context of Matthew 24 concerns these two questions. When shall these things be? That is concerning the desolation of Jerusalem. And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? That deals with the end of this present evil world and the bringing in of the world to come. And Christ, the context of Matthew 24 is Jesus Christ answering these two questions. He doesn't ignore them. He starts giving them the answer to these two questions, right? From verse 15, Matthew 24, verse 15 down to verse 28, he answers the first question. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, meaning if you want to understand Matthew 24, you not only have to understand the context of Matthew 24, but you have to understand prophecy. Because in order to understand what he's talking about here, it says in verse 15, whoso readeth, let him understand. Meaning you have to understand some things spoken of by Daniel the prophet, meaning not only do you have to understand the context of Matthew 24, you have to understand Matthew 24 in the context of the Bible. That there's a historical context to what Jesus Christ is talking about. And from verse 15 to verse 28, he answers the first question about when shall these things be? Well, he tells them, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Why? For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And so he's telling them when the things he spoke about concerning destruction, he's telling them when those things are going to be. And then he answers the second question, beginning in verse 29, when he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. And so the context we're dealing with here concerns the two questions that they ask. When shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And he answers those two questions. And so since Matthew 24, now understand what I'm about to tell you. Since Matthew 24 revolves around the temple and Jerusalem and its destruction, you have two options when dealing with Matthew 24. First option is that everything's already been fulfilled because the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. That's option number one. Now, we don't believe that. I don't believe that. I'm going to show you why I don't believe that. The second option is Matthew 24 awaits future fulfillment, and before it can be fulfilled, there must be a temple rebuilt in Jerusalem. And these things cannot be fulfilled until there is a temple in Jerusalem. Right? Hold your place there and come to 2 Thessalonians again. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And the point being, guys, you either have to believe that this was already fulfilled at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, or you believe that it has a future fulfillment in which there's going to be a rebuilt temple. But no matter which position you take, you cannot believe that Matthew 24 is being fulfilled today because there is no temple in Jerusalem. And trying to convince your church every time there's an earthquake or every time they hear of a war that they're living in those times prophesied in Matthew 24 is grave error. Just trying to scare your church into thinking that something's at hand when it's not at hand. And when you do that, you're actually robbing Christians of the helmet of their salvation, because God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation. And Paul tells us that is our hope. And he pleads in 2 Thessalonians, by the rapture and by our hope of obtaining salvation, not to be soon shaken and troubled, as that the day of Christ is at hand. And so look at 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day, talking about the day of Christ, that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth get it now, in the temple of God, shewing himself that he is God. And so Paul is very clear here. He wants believers to understand that regardless of what any man says, regardless of how many people get up and preach Matthew 24 and tell you it's here, it's here, it's here. They've been doing it for hundreds of years, thousands of years, been misusing the Bible for thousands of years. And they constantly say, oh, this is it, this is it, this is it. And yet it hasn't come. And the reason Paul points to one specific thing, that before the day of Christ can come, the man of sin must sit in the temple of God and shew himself that he is God. He must be revealed to the world as a deception that he is God. And the whole world's going to worship him at that time. But once again, the day of Christ cannot come until the man of sin reveals himself in the temple of God, and there is no temple of God. And so you cannot use Matthew 24 to point to the signs of the times that we live in, because we're not living in the times of those signs. Those signs are for people living in the 70th week of Daniel, to give them a chronology of events so that they won't be deceived. And to use it for any other reason than that is to, even if you think people try to use Matthew 24 to preach the rapture. Well, now you've done pushed the rapture up to a point where there has to be a temple before we can be raptured. And therefore you just give every generation of man a reason not to look for the Lord to come. And Paul said we are looking for our Savior from heaven. And so understand the importance of that, guys, that people remove Matthew 24 out of its context concerning the temple and its destruction. And once you understand that, you've got two choices. It's either already happened or it's future. Now, the preterist will tell you that it's already happened. But we don't believe that. We're going to show you why we don't believe it. Because the preterist makes a second error, right? And the second error he makes, not only is Matthew 24 removed from its immediate context, but the second problem people make, and the second error they make, is they remove Matthew 24 from its biblical context. Meaning you've got to understand Matthew 24 in the context of the Bible. Meaning Matthew 24 must be understood in things that's already happened, history, prophecy, and moving forward into things that have not yet been fulfilled. And so in order to understand the things Christ is talking about in Matthew 24, you have to have some understanding of some things that's already happened and the things that God has already spoken in the prophetic scriptures to understand the context in which Matthew 24 is spoken. And so, as much as I hate to, and no matter how much we've already talked about this stuff, in order to understand Matthew 24, we must review some history in order to understand the context. And by doing this, I'm going to prove to you that AD 70 and the Romans destroying Jerusalem was never prophesied, nor did Christ ever speak of it. When Christ speaks of the destruction of Jerusalem, he is always speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to happen in the final 7 years in the 70th week of Daniel, because the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70 was never prophesied. The entire time period we live in was something unspoken something kept hid and secret in God. That includes the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. In AD 70, we were already in this present dispensation. And because of that, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans was never prophesied. It was also a part of something hidden God. And that's what we're going to prove. But we have to go back, guys, and remember some things. We're just going to cover this real quick because this leads up to the context of Matthew 24. Remember in our previous studies that we talked about the 5 courses of punishment. Israel being a covenant people under the law, God had made them a people of covenant, a people of put them under the law to serve him, and to make them a holy nation. Back in Leviticus 26, he told them that if they disobeyed him, that he was going to send 5 different courses of punishment to correct them for disobedience. The first course, he was going to put their enemies over them in the land. The second course, he was going to punish the land itself. The third course, he was going to devour their children with wild beasts. The fourth course, he would bring the sword to punish them, warfare. And the fifth course, they were going to be kicked out of the land and taken captive into the nations of the earth. And we studied this stuff in timeline. If you look here on the timeline that I got up on the screen, the first course of punishment happened during the book of Judges. Many times God put their enemies to rule over them, and then when they would repent, he would send a judge to deliver them. And then they would go back to their wicked ways. He'd put their enemies over them, and then he'd send judges to correct them. The second course of punishment, God divides the kingdom of Israel into 2 different kingdoms, Judah and Israel. And then the second course of punishment begins in the days of Elijah, when God shuts up the heavens that it rains not. He begins to correct them by making their land desolate, by not giving them rain. The third course of punishment happened in the days of Elisha. They entered into the third course there when those wild beasts come out, those she-bears come out and devour 40-some children. And God's letting you know that they're in the third course of punishment. This happens in the book of 2 Kings. The fourth course of punishment begins around the death of Uzziah, when God begins to punish Israel and the nation with warfare. You have Syria and Israel warring against Judah, and you have the Assyrian coming in, destroying Israel and taking Israel captive in the book of 2 Kings. I believe it's chapter 17. And then in the fifth course of punishment, Judah is taken captive and Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians. And this fulfilled what God told Solomon about the temple that he had built, that if those kings of Israel would not obey him, that he was going to forsake that house and bring it to nothing. He was going to destroy it, which is exactly what he did. In 2 Kings 25, Judah is taken captive, and then Babylon destroys Jerusalem. All right. Now, right here, we're leading up to Matthew 24 up here, where Christ speaks Matthew 24 before going to the cross. And there's already been some things spoken about time that you got to understand in order to understand Matthew 24. There's already been prophecy about Jerusalem, right? First off, it was going to lie desolate for 70 years. Jerusalem was going to lie desolate for 70 years. That's spoken in Jeremiah 25, verse 11. This whole land shall be desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Jeremiah 29 and 10 says, For thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. And so they're going to remain in Babylon for 70 years, and the whole land is going to be a desolation for 70 years. At the end of it, at the end of that 70 years, he's going to send them home, cause them to return to that place and to rebuild it, right? And this brings us to Daniel chapter 9. I'm going through this quick, guys, so that we can get back to Matthew 24, but I want you to understand the context. While they're in that 70-year period, Daniel receives an additional revelation to what Jeremiah received. Jeremiah prophesied the 70 years. Well, Daniel receives a revelation concerning Judah, concerning Jerusalem and his people, that there's an additional time period that's been determined upon them to bring everything to pass, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness. And this additional time period here is when all things are going to be fulfilled. And so what's revealed here is that 77-year periods have been determined upon Israel, or upon Jerusalem and Israel. And that brings you to 490 years. But they're divided up into three different time periods, as we're going to see here. And so notice in Matthew or Daniel 9:25, he says, Know therefore and understand. That's the commandment here, is for him to know and understand. Know it and understand it. So many people do not know nor understand this stuff, and that's why when they get to Matthew 24, they just make it up, because they don't understand the context. They don't understand, first off, the context of Matthew 24, nor do they understand Matthew 24 in the context of the Bible. Christ didn't just speak these things out of nowhere. There's context to it. And so he says, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince. And so get that right there. This first time period runs from the commandment to restore Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince. All right, so know and understand that from the moment this commandment goes forth to restore and to build Jerusalem, because it's in desolation from the Babylonians, and he says from the moment that this commandment is gone forth to restore and to build Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince comes, then he lays out two different time periods. It shall be 7 weeks, 7-year periods. That's 49 years. And that 49 years happens in the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they go back to restore and to build. The commandment to return and to restore and build Jerusalem actually happens in the book of Nehemiah. And then there's a 49-year period there in which they restore and build Jerusalem. And then he lays out, and 62 weeks, or 434 years. In other words, after that first 49-year period, there was going to be a 434-year period after the rebuilding of Jerusalem until the Messiah shall come. Right? And I know we've studied this, guys, but just understand it. Right? In fact, let's go back, look at the timeline. So you had these 70 years of desolation The commandment to restore and to rebuild happened. And then you had these 49 years here. And then there's 434 years unto the Messiah the Prince. When he enters Jerusalem in Matthew 21 and goes into the temple and drives out the money changers and says, my house shall be called a house of prayer. At the end of Matthew 23, he leaves the temple after he says, your house is left unto you desolate. So when he enters Jerusalem, he calls it my house. And when he leaves, he calls it your house. And then he goes out in Matthew 24 and says, this temple and all these buildings are going to be destroyed. And he's saying that according to prophecy. Because in Daniel 9:26, the Messiah comes after that 62 weeks, he comes. And then it says, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And so after those 62 weeks are fulfilled, Daniel's told that the Messiah, when he comes, is going to be cut off. And this is why Christ tells him in Matthew 16:21, as he begins to head to Jerusalem that final time, it says, from that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go into Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised again the third day. And so Christ knows that when he goes to Jerusalem for that final Passover, that he's going to be cut off. He's going to suffer, be killed, and rise again from the third day. He knows that. It's what's written about him. And he begins to teach it to his disciples. All right. Then in Matthew 9:26, after the Messiah is cut off, now watch this, because this is going to help you understand Matthew 24. After the Messiah is cut off, it says, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. That's what Christ is talking about, Matthew 24. That after he's cut off, there's going to be a prince that comes, and the people of that prince is going to destroy Jerusalem and the temple and the sanctuary. Right? Now, Daniel understands fully who that prince is. He saw him back in Daniel 7, the horn that arises out of that fourth beast. He saw this prince in Daniel 8, the horn that arises out of those four horns of the goat, and how he destroys and trods underfoot the sanctuary and desecrates and makes the temple desolate. Daniel knows exactly what prince this is talking about. When Gabriel tells him here about the prince that shall come, Daniel's already seen this coming prince. What Gabriel's doing here in Daniel 9 is giving Daniel the timing and the chronology so that Daniel can better understand the visions that he's already saw. And so watch this now. The people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Now notice that. What he's saying is there's a war coming, there's a prince coming that's going to make war against this city. And he's going to destroy the city and the sanctuary. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. Meaning until that war ends, desolation is going to, Jerusalem is going to lie desolate and utterly destroyed. Meaning, now get this, guys, that means that you cannot believe that this is about the Romans and yet believe in a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Because what he says here is that from the moment this city is destroyed, It's going to lie desolate until that war is over. And the war he's talking about is the war that starts in Revelation 12. When the dragon's cast out of heaven and he goes to make war against the woman. And Jerusalem is going to be destroyed at that time. And that woman flees into the wilderness, and to the end of that war, desolations are determined. He is talking about the 70th week of Daniel. This has nothing to do with the Romans. The Romans did not destroy Jerusalem as a part of this 70-week prophecy. The 70 AD did not belong to this time period of the 70 weeks. It stands outside of the 70 weeks. It happened that Rome destroyed Jerusalem during a unprophesied period of time. They destroyed Jerusalem outside of a period of time dealing with these 70 weeks. That's so important to get, because many great Bible teachers, C.I. Scofield, Clarence Larkin, Peter Ruckman, even Bollinger, men like that, they all believed that Matthew 24 was about the Romans. Luke 21 was about the Romans. They come back here and they make this prophecy about the Romans destroying Jerusalem. But the Romans did not destroy Jerusalem within these 70 weeks that's been determined upon Jerusalem. And so the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans was a part of the mystery period that we live in. And so you got to get that, man. You got to understand that, or you're going to come to a preterist point of view that if Rome was the ones that fulfilled this prophecy, then everything's been fulfilled, and there's nothing left to be fulfilled, right? And so understand this, that the Messiah is going to be cut off, and after he's cut off, there's a prince that's going to come that's going to destroy the city and the sanctuary. And this is why Christ in Luke 19, 41 through 44, as he came to Jerusalem, when he was come near, he beheld, get that now, the city. Because what's the prince going to destroy? The city, right? And when he comes to Jerusalem in Luke 19, when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it, saying, if thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, and the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the days shall come upon thee. There's days coming upon the city, because they did not know thy day. They did not know this time of their visitation and the things that belong unto their peace. And because of this, because they didn't receive their Messiah when he come and he was cut off, he says, the days shall come upon thee that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee and compass thee round and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground. He's talking about the city there, that their enemies are going to come and lay that city to the ground, right? That's in fulfillment. That's in fulfillment of this prophecy here in Daniel 9:26. The people of the prince that shall come, that's their enemies. The enemies of Jerusalem are going to come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. Christ weeps over Jerusalem when he enters into it as the Messiah, because he already knows that they're blind, that they cannot see and understand these things, and that he's going to be rejected and cut off, that these things are hid from their eyes. And because of that, there's days coming upon that city in which their enemies are going to come and utterly destroy and lay that city desolate. Once again, it's not about the Romans, right? because Matthew 9:27 makes it clear when these things are going to happen. 9:27 says, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Now that is about that there, the he there is the prince that shall come, right? And so after the Messiah is cut off, there's going to be a 7-year period in which a covenant is confirmed. And in the midst of the week, I don't have that up there, but in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined be poured upon the desolate. And so what Daniel's told here is that final week, that prince is going to come. He's going to confirm a covenant. And then in the middle of that covenant, that prince is going to take away the daily sacrifice. And then he is going to make Jerusalem desolate, even until the consummation. The consummation there means until the entire 70th week is fulfilled. Jerusalem is going to lie desolate until the consummation of the 70th week, until that entire time period is over, right? And so just understand that, man, that this has nothing to do with the Romans. Everything is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem under the Antichrist during the 70th week of Daniel. That has to do with prophecy. And this is why Christ, if you look in Matthew 24:15, we know exactly what Christ is talking about and what time period he's talking about. Look at Matthew 24:15. Now remember, they asked him, when shall these things be concerning the destruction of Jerusalem? When are these things going to happen? Well, he tells them in Matthew 24 that they're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet. That's just the beginning of sorrows. But in Matthew 24:15, he says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. He's saying Jerusalem, this destruction and this desolation is not going to come until you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Well, that's what we're reading about in Daniel 9:27. And so how can Christ be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70 when he clearly tells you in Matthew 24:15 that he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to happen in the 70th week of Daniel when they see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet? And so every man trying to teach Matthew 24 about any other time period than the time period of the 70th week that's been determined upon Jerusalem is in error. He's removed this whole chapter from the context. And usually when people do that, when they remove the Bible from its context, it's because they're trying to prove a point that they have. They don't really care about correct biblical interpretation. And so when you read this, when you come to verse 15 and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, you better go back to Daniel and see what he's talking about, because he said, whoso readeth, let him understand. Meaning, if you're reading that in Matthew 24:15, you need to understand. And if you don't understand, you better go back to Daniel. You better understand the abomination of desolation. We just read about it in Daniel 9:27. You read about it in Daniel 8, Daniel 11. And so, listen, man, God is not, ignorance of the Bible is no excuse, right? God wrote the book. God gave us the book. He expects us to study the book. And if we run our mouths in ignorance of the book, God is not going to hold us guiltless for the errors that we make, because he gave us this word and he guides us through it. He says, go back and understand the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet. And yet, the vast majority of Bible teachers get here in Matthew 24 and they start talking about, oh, there was an earthquake and there was a war. It's at hand. The end is coming. The end is coming. Or they come over here and they say, well, Jesus here is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Nonsense. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple during the 70th week of Daniel, meaning before the 70th week of Daniel can be fulfilled, there has to be a temple in Jerusalem. And there's not one today. And so quit trying to convince people that something is at hand when it's not. Be honest men with the word of God, because you are going to rob people of the blessed hope that the church has. The next event in biblical chronology is the fullness of the Gentiles and the rapture of the body of Christ into the heavenly places. That's the next event. And Paul pleads with men because of that to not be deceived and be troubled and shaken, as that the day of Christ is at hand. Every bit of this in Matthew 24 is on hold and is being withheld until this church is complete, guys. All right. And so, real quick, after when Christ speaks Matthew 24, he's getting ready to be cut off, as Daniel 9:26 says, and he knows that after his cutting off, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed in that final 7-year period that's been determined upon him. That's the context of Matthew 24. And after he rose from the dead, his disciples asked him in Acts 1:6-7, when they therefore were come together, they asked of him, saying, Lord, wilt thou at this time restore again the kingdom to Israel? Now, before the kingdom can be restored to Israel, that final 7 years has to be fulfilled. And that's all they know in Acts chapter 1. That the mystery has not been revealed yet in Acts chapter 1. They're looking for the restoration of the kingdom. They're asking him, is this the time to restore again the kingdom to Israel? And he said unto them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father hath put in his own power. Now, it doesn't end there, guys. There's a whole book of Acts that was written showing you what happened after the Lord went back to heaven. And so a lot of people, they're in a pre-Pauline revelation mindset. They don't understand the revelation given to Paul, and they're still in the same ignorance that these men at the opening of the book of Acts were in. And the reason I say ignorance, I'm not being mean. Things weren't revealed to them yet. They're looking for the restoration of the kingdom to Israel. That's all they know. They don't know anything about the mystery yet. For you to be in that mindset and to be using Matthew 24 incorrectly and to be in this pre-Paul revelation mindset that these men were in, without this time thinking that it's time to do something that it's not, it's inexcusable. It's completely inexcusable, because we know from the revelation given to Paul that Israel fell in Acts chapter 7. And through their fall, salvation has come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. And that Israel at this present time is in a state of partial blindness until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. It's what Paul calls this mystery, that we are living in a time in which all Israel is not being saved as it was written in prophecy, but that a part of Israel is being saved, as well as a fullness out of the Gentiles is being come in, because God sent salvation to them also, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And through that salvation, God is taking part of Israel and a fullness of the Gentiles to fulfill a mystery that he kept hid from the beginning of the world. And so after Christ went back to heaven, here on our timeline, Israel fell in Acts 7. Paul is called, and then God revealed this mystery. Well, when did the Romans destroy Jerusalem? They destroyed Jerusalem close to 40 years after Israel fell and Paul was called, and salvation was sent to the Gentiles. That means the destruction of Jerusalem was by the Romans was not a part of prophetic revelation. The destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans happened during the time period of the mystery, and therefore was not prophesied or spoken of by Jesus Christ. Right? And so to try to make that about prophecy is a great error. All right? And so we see from this timeline, guys, that everything spoken about concerning the destruction of Jerusalem in this final 7 years up here is not going to happen until the fullness of this dispensation comes in. This time period concerning the mystery must be fulfilled, and then that 70th week is going to happen. And so the biblical context, back to Matthew 24, the biblical context of Matthew 24 is that when Christ speaks Matthew 24, 69 of the 70 weeks have been fulfilled. Jesus Christ is about to be cut off after 62 weeks. He's about to go to the cross and die. And all that remains prophetically is the destruction of Jerusalem in the midst of the 70th week. That's why he says what he does in Matthew 24. That this city is going to be utterly destroyed. Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Because prophetically, after he's cut off, the 70th week comes and Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And then they ask him, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And Christ begins to answer those questions. And so everything Christ speaks of in Matthew 24 pertains to the final time period that's been determined upon Jerusalem and upon those people. This is why he never says, let them which be in Manila flee to the mountains. Let them which be in London flee to the mountains. Let them which be in New York flee into the mountains. He says, let them which be in Judea. Why? Because that great tribulation is going to come upon those people and upon Jerusalem. In fact, if you look at Luke 21, Luke chapter 21, he makes it very clear, again, in verse number 20, and when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Verse 24, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And you're told what that is in Revelation chapter 11. It's 42 months that the Gentiles are going to tread Jerusalem underfoot. And so it all deals with the 70th week, and trying to make Matthew 24 about anything else other than the 70th week that's been prophesied is a great error. And it leads to all the errors that people make when using Matthew 24. And so real quick, an overview of Matthew 24 and 25. And next week, guys, we're going to go verse by verse through this. Because it's only 2 chapters, we got plenty of time to go through this verse by verse. But right here's an overview of it. From verse 4 to verse 14 is about Christ telling them to take heed that no man deceive you. And what he does here is, number one, notice what he says in verse 6, Matthew 24 and 6. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Notice that wars and rumors of wars are not a sign of anything. He says these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So every time there's a war that breaks out, somebody's like, oh, this is the end, this is the end. Christ didn't say wars and rumors of wars were a sign of anything. He says they must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Then he says, nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in divers places. Then in verse 8, he says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. And so from verse 8 down to verse 14, you have the beginning of sorrows. And then verse 14, he says, and then shall the end come. And so verse 4 through 14 is a chronology from the beginning of sorrows unto the end, right? Then in verse 15, beginning in verse 15 down to verse 28, he speaks of when the destruction of Jerusalem is going to come. That when you see the abomination of desolation, then shall be great tribulation. And so from verse 15 down to verse 28 deals with the great tribulation that's going to come when the abomination of desolation stands in the holy place. Then from verse 29 to verse 31, he deals with after the tribulation of those days. All right. Then from verse 32 to verse 35, he says, now learn a parable of the fig tree. So there's something for him to learn about these things. When you begin to see all these things, or when you see all these things. And so this is the layout here. Beginning of sorrows unto the end. Great tribulation after the tribulation. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. Understand something. Understand this parable as it pertains to the things he just spoke to them in Matthew 24. Then from verse 36 down to verse 41, he tells them, of that day and hour knoweth no man. Hang on one. I'll call back. Sorry, guys, I'm getting phone calls. From verse 36 to verse 41 deals with watch therefore. And then he tells them, that day and hour knoweth no man. And so what he's telling them here is that it's going to be just like the days of Noah. That just like nobody paid attention, nobody cared, and then the flood came and took them all away. He said, this is exactly what these days are going to be like. Men are going to be eating and drinking, and then I'm going to come and judge the world, and they ain't going to know what hit them. But so in light of this, because no man knows the day nor the hour, and it's going to be like the days of Noah, from verse 42 down to verse 51, he warns them to watch, to always be ready and to be watching for that coming when these times come. But we're going to see that they're not commanded to watch for the coming of the Lord until they begin to see these things. And then he comes into chapter 25 from verses 1 to 13. He teaches a parable of the 10 virgins. And he begins this parable with then, meaning at this time period, when these things are coming to pass, he says the kingdom of heaven is going to be like unto 10 virgins. From verse 14 to verse 30, he explains that parable of the 10 virgins by saying, for the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country. And he teaches this parable of the talents, that he's going to come and judge the foolish and the wise, and give his reward, give the reward based upon that. He's going to judge his servants. And then from verse 31 to 46, he lays out the parable of the sheep and the goats, that not only is he going to judge his servants, but he's going to judge all nations. And the nations that bless Israel are going to go into the kingdom, and those who curse Israel are going to be cast out of that kingdom into everlasting fire that's been prepared for the devil and his angels. And so that's an overview of Matthew 24 and 25. And it all deals with the 70th week of Daniel, leading up to the second coming of the Lord and his judgment of the present evil world, and leading into the establishment of the kingdom and the world to come that's going to be under subjection to Jesus Christ. And next week, guys, we'll start getting into this verse by verse. But this was necessary, guys, to get you to understand the context. There's so much error about Matthew 24 because people don't study it in context. They make it about the Romans, or they make it about the time that they live in, and they just don't have understanding of these things. And so understanding it in its context, dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem and the time of the 70th week, helps you to understand this chapter and keep it separated from the time that we live in which God is not dealing with Israel prophetically. He is dealing with Israel according to the mystery, in which part of them is being saved and the fullness of the Gentiles is being brought into that salvation because of Israel's fall. This is Israel during the mystery. And so all Israel's going to be saved, as it is written prophetically. That 70th week is going to happen, and Israel's going to be saved at the second coming, but it awaits the fulfillment of the mystery. And so you got to take Matthew 24, and now that Paul's mystery has been revealed, you got to push Matthew 24 all the way up to the future, after our dispensation, before that 70th week is going to be fulfilled and Jesus Christ returns to the earth. And so next week we'll start looking at these things verse by verse